Hello and welcome to the Advantage IQ webinar, using your data to make informed decisions. My name is Joy and I will be assisting with the webinar today. To eliminate background noise, we ask that all phone lines remain muted throughout today's presentation. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, you can do so by submitting a Q&A at the bottom right of your screen or using the chat feature, and we will address as many questions as needed at the conclusion of the presentation. Further instruction will be provided prior to the Q&A. I would now like to introduce your host for today, Jim Pode. Jim is the Area Vice President of Sales for Advantage IQ. Jim, you now have the floor.
Thanks, Joy, and good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Using Your Data to Make Informed Decisions. Today I'm going to be joined by my colleague, Rick Clough. Rick is our Director of Resource and Analytics at Advantage IQ. I will review the agenda and summarize after the webinar and go through our next webinar session, as well as turn it over to Joy for question and answers. So please hold your questions throughout the webinar, and at the end of it we'll try to address each and every one of the questions. As it states today, our webinar and our agenda as it relates to using your data to make informed decisions, it all starts with the data. Whether you're managing or improving the way energy is purchased, or reducing energy consumption, or evaluating and explaining variances as it relates to budgets, or trying to comply with sustainability requirements, it's all going to be developed as it relates to the data that you have from your portfolio and that you've captured from your portfolio. In the graphic that you're seeing there, these are examples of data and how data would translate into knowledge or action or results. And Rick will talk about all these activities as it relates to what you do with your data, how much data do you need, where it comes from, and what to do with it once you get it. So I'll now turn it over to Rick Clough. Rick, you have the floor.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you for attending this morning. For most of you, it's relatively early in the year. For a number of you, depending upon your fiscal calendar, your year just ended a couple of weeks ago, or for others of you, you may be only in your second month of the new fiscal year. So what we tried to do today a little bit was to take a step back. We're going to talk about 4 specific topics like Jim mentioned, and all of these topics, admittedly, at some point throughout the year, we're going to devote a full webinar to each of these topics, but really today we're kind of stepping back and looking at it from the holistic approach of using information in 4 specific areas. Certainly there are others, but we're quickly going to touch on 4 today from kind of the perspective of some tips and reminders as your new year gets started, just ways to think about using the information that you have at your disposal to help you with your energy management. One specific area is managing your deregulated energy spend. Certainly your AP and finance departments all capture and code your information into your GL, but quite often you're going to need a lot more information to go out and manage your deregulated energy spend. Certainly one area is looking at your usage and spend profiles that you'll use to really kind of develop a deregulated strategy around your procurement activities. And admittedly, that's an entire webinar by itself that we'll be doing during the year. But 2 other things to think about is when you're going through and you're having to put information out for RFP, you're going to need information about your sites, including the utility that serves each site. You'll need things like account numbers, meter numbers, and location identification. For example, in Texas, you have the easy IDs. You'll need to be able to provide that and make that part of your solicitation that goes out to the suppliers. Once you've made your contract decisions and you've done that analysis, about 1 to 2 months after your contracts have changed over, if you've changed suppliers or you've merely changed your contract rates or terms with a supplier, you're going to want to make sure that you're going back and looking at that billing information to make sure that you're being billed correctly, that all of your sites are enrolled properly. Sometimes you may not get full sites. During the process of going through your procurement effort, you may add new sites or close sites from your portfolio. You'll need to make sure that those sites are enrolled properly. The other thing you'll also need to make sure of is that in that changeover, to make sure that if you were with the LDC or the default provider previously, that you make sure that billing for the commodity portion stops whether it be from that LDC or another supplier, to make sure that there's no overlap and you aren't billed twice. Reducing energy consumption. There are certainly many ways to use capital dollars to improve energy efficiency, things around energy management systems, lighting retrofits, and other types of infrastructure things. At the same time, one of the cheapest ways to go about improving your energy performance is through driving behavior. Again, on the AP and finance side, you will have a wealth of information about your financial in dollars, but quite often you don't have information about the usage and the performance. Really, to assess at a regional or site level, you need that consumption data, and you also need to make it meaningful and actionable for your organization within that throughout the organization. As far as using that consumption data to drive behavior, you really want to look at your entire portfolio of sites or regions. Using the data from your utility bills in terms of consumption, you can look at that in terms of a benchmark, and a scatter plot, as we show here, is just an example of how my sites are doing in terms of usage per square foot, for example. That will help you identify where really to focus attention for maximum return, whether that be in terms of behavior or for identifying opportunities for capital investments and how you might best use that capital budget. At the same time, by looking across regions and exposing your entire organization to that, you can also encourage some competition and identify some best practices, certainly taking advantage of what folks down at the site level or facility level know, and what somebody's found at one site, sharing that to use that within another site or region can be very powerful. Some example benchmarks to use would be kWh per square foot, BTUs per square foot, or usage per some level of production units. If you're a hotel, rooms sold, obviously, transactions, things like that, things that drive the usage in your business, using those as benchmarks to identify sites that are more or less efficient than others. And as far as comparing those sites, looking at those sites either from a year-over-year perspective, comparing against a baseline performance, also looking again at the site, regional, and corporate level results. One of the big things you want to be able to do is to drive that accountability down within the organization to make everyone partake in supporting your energy efficiency efforts. You really want to identify good and poor performers, obviously, and recognize and reward the best practices. The other thing to think about is you may spend a lot of time and effort on energy efficiency and make a big push. Something you can also use your data and information for is from a maintenance and sustaining the energy efficiencies that you implement. If you go and implement a number of things, you certainly want to verify that changes did occur, that you indeed are getting the ROI out of that lighting retrofit or EMS install, but you also want to make sure that you sustain that level of performance and you don't have people slipping back into old bad habits and so on. Something else you can look at is, as many of you are aware, with Energy Star through the Portfolio Manager, getting scores for your sites in somewhat of a peer-based benchmarking measure. And the one thing you want to think about there is you may have some number of sites that are scoring 75 or above and are eligible for labels, but really how do I translate my energy efficiency into moving more and more sites from the 75 and below groupings into that 75? How can I make that my portfolio even better and migrate that way? And one thing I want to mention before we leave this topic, in terms of it's great to use your data and do things like that, but one of the things you need to think about ahead of pulling these types of reports and generating this type of information program, also making sure that you have the infrastructure in place within your organization that will allow you to drive change within the organization, whether that be a mandate or whether that be you just have a set of facility management or managers in place where you can drive that down through the organization so you can really take action on what data is telling you. The next area we'll talk about a little bit is year-over-year and month-over-month variances relative to your budget. I'm sure most of you have received variance reports on a regular basis from your finance group, and typically the question is, why are you over or under budget? And typically, finance is going to be really good at that financial information, but may not have the information available in order to explain what's driving those variances. So things you'll need to identify are, what's driving my cost? Is it unit price? Is it usage changes that have gone on? And identifying where it's really occurring within my portfolio, so not only you can report and resolve those variances, but also take action going into the future, whether that involves doing some reforecasting because some set of assumptions of your budget is now incorrect or has changed, but also just, again, going back to the change within the organization, allowing you to take positive action within the organization. In terms of the information that you need to resolve and identify and analyze those types of variances, there's three areas where you'll need that data, but can also lead to your issues with the variance. So in terms of your budget assumptions, one thing we really encourage clients to do is to keep track of your budget assumptions at least in unit price and consumption terms, so you have those two components. So as you're navigating throughout the year, you can track how much have I used relative to what I planned, and how much is that each unit of energy costing me relative to what I planned. Another set of budget assumptions that you may want to keep around is, when you built that budget, what rate change assumptions did you make, and at what level? Did you make them at the state level, at a utility level? What assumptions did you have around your contracts going forward? So that's your set of assumptions. Now your actuals as they occur, you're going to be receiving bills obviously throughout the year. And through that you may receive rebills, you may get credits from prior billings or things like that are going to influence your variances, so you need access to that kind of information. There's also the black hole of accruals in terms of for most organizations, there is some level of financial accrual that happens with the utilities each month, and understanding how those are booked and being able to have insight into those. And as most of you know, certainly each month you have a new accrual that you're booking, but you're also reversing that accrual from the prior month. And if there's fluctuation in those from the prior month, that's going to impact the current month. So having insight into that is something that can often be necessary and may cause variances through no fault or issue around actual usage and things, but may have something to do with an accrual. Then there's ancillary data. So once you've gotten past I've got my bills in correctly and there aren't issues just with the billing cycles, or I don't have issues with accruals, there's just what's causing these variances to occur. Could it be due to weather? Could there be other things that are driving my costs, such as I've added a site that maybe we hadn't planned on, or we've opened up 10 new sites 3 months earlier than we planned, things like that. Or if you've made operational changes, if you've converted sites from a regular operating day to 24-hour operations, or you've just made operational changes, that's another set of information that you'll need to help you track and identify and explain those variances. The last area we'd like to talk about a little bit today is sustainability and how you can comply with that and support that through your energy data. This is certainly becoming more and more important for most of our clients in terms of, even if it's just internal reporting around sustainability, but also with external reporting entities such as the Carbon Disclosure Project and so on. So quite often that involves establishing some level of a baseline year in order to measure your progress and change from that point in time. But also you really want to be in a position where you can confidently, and from an auditing standpoint, report your results and be confident in what you're reporting around your organization, whether it be information going to an external registry such as the Carbon Disclosure Project, or just purely for your own internal tracking and monitoring. One of the best things here is to really collect this information as you go. For a large portion of our client portfolios, the indirect emissions that come from the generation of the electricity and gas that your sites use accounts oftentimes for 70 to 80% of your overall greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a whole lot easier to capture all of that information and maintain and manage it as you're navigating through the year, then at the end of the year having to suddenly go collect all of that information. And again, it's the type of information that finance, even though it's all getting reported through your GL, you won't have that usage information typically. You'll certainly want to track that both at the enterprise level and quite often down throughout the organization. Other things from a Scope 3 types of emissions, do you have a fleet? Do you track business travel? Are those things material to your overall footprint? So things like that you're going to want to be watching for. The other thing is, while if your business is growing, and you may want to look at operational characteristics and to look at it from an intensity standpoint, so that you're looking at, is the intensity of my overall greenhouse gas emissions changing relative to my business? So if my portfolio has more square footage in it now, more than likely my carbon footprint would have increased, but the intensity hopefully is going down. So measuring that again relative to square footage or transactions or those kinds of production units, hopefully you can still show that that is decreasing. So we've talked about four areas, and again, we've really only scratched the surface on these, but from a early in the year type of perspective, and you're kind of setting goals for the year and so on, just some things for you to think about as you start working through your plans for this year. Jim, I'll turn it back to you to summarize.
Okay, thanks, Rick. So as Rick highlighted throughout the webinar, energy management, no matter whether you are managing your cost or your use or trying to measure from a sustainability standpoint, information obviously is important in how you do that. So proper energy management is really information intensive, and gathering that information and how you use it and what you use it for is critical to help that process. There's a ton of data out there that's available, but once you get the data, what you do with it and how you turn that data into some type of an actionable lead to produce results is kind of up to you on what information you try to capture. So getting information and applying it properly, making sure that you're having the action to produce results is critical. So our next webinar series is Energy Management 101. It's Thursday, March 10th at 8:30 Pacific Standard Time. For those interested, we have a telecom expense management series. Our dial-in savings webinar is our best practices for telemanagement, coming up Wednesday, February 16th at 8:30 p.m. If you know of anybody that's interested in either one of these webinars, please either contact us by emailing us at webinars@AdvantageIQ or call us directly. So I'll turn it back over to Joy, and she'll coordinate the question and answers.
Thank you. Before we open up for Q&A, just want to let you know that after the webinar, you will be redirected to a brief survey. If you could please just leave feedback as it relates to this specific webinar, we would appreciate that in planning for future sessions. So with that, if you'd like to ask a typed question, you can click on the question mark icon located in the floating toolbar on the bottom right side of your screen, or use the chat feature. We will address as many questions as needed. The first question that has come in, you mentioned maintaining budget assumptions. Can you make recommendations around building my budget?
What we typically recommend to clients is to look at their most recent, hopefully 12 months worth of consumption and usage and unit price information across their portfolio, typically at least down to the site level, going through that information, reviewing that to make sure that there aren't billing anomalies that occurred last year that are things we wouldn't plan for next year. Once you have that set of baseline data, then apply changes that you foresee in the following year, whether that be you're going through energy efficiency efforts and you're going to be expecting some level of usage change, adding in new sites, extracting old sites, then also layering on with that what you might see from a utility rate forecast standpoint, whether that be information you gather from the Energy Information Administration at the state level, state and regional level, or whether you're actually tracking or having someone track what's going on at the utilities for you. Something we also very much encourage folks to do is to make sure that your budgeting assumptions around your calendar and how your booking expenses marries up with how you build your budget with how you actually book expenses, making sure how you do book accruals and confirming that you do in terms of how you lay out that calendar to make sure that those sets of assumptions are in sync.
Thank you, Rick. Another question that has come in: how much data do clients need to establish information to make these types of decisions?
Typically, what we like to see is at least 12 months, so you have a full usage cycle of what goes on throughout a year. Certainly, the more you get, the better off you are. So certainly, if you can get back when we do energy performance reporting for folks, certainly having a couple of years' worth of information can be very helpful.
Thank you, Rick. We have had a few requests for copies of the presentation, and we're happy to send that out. Just send me a note, or after the webinar, you can email us at webinars@advantageiq.com to request that information as well. Next question that's come in: is there low-cost software to use for data evaluation? Do I need to build my own database?
There are a number of pieces of software out there that are available for you to manage this process yourself at probably reasonable costs. And certainly you can build your own database. The expense from that standpoint, that expense is probably small relative to the expense of actually gathering and maintaining all of this information, in terms of you've got to get the bills, you need to enter the data off of those bills, and while indeed it's all utility information, virtually every single utility out there has their own billing format. So making the interpretation of the level of data that you get and then how to pull that data off of each and every bill really can be problematic, and quite honestly is probably where most of that expense will ultimately be relative to the actual cost of identifying and implementing a solution within your organization.
Thank you, Rick. Have another question just come in. What are the best databases to find comparative data on BTU per square foot or kilowatt per person for various spaces such as office, retail, hospitality?
There's some information out within that the EPA system was based upon, that was the CBEX, the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey that's done periodically. That has a set of information there that has some high-level benchmarks in terms of looking at use per square foot, usage intensities for those various segments. Those are some of the best ones. Like I said, those are some of the best ones that I know of. There's also information out there, and I can't think of the places right now, that also may give you some level of insight into how that load breaks down within a building. So 20% may be for within a segment, 20% may be for your HVAC load, 30% for your cooking load, for example, or things like that. Those I don't have right at the tip of my fingers right now.
Thank you, Rick. Another question that was just asked: we operate several large old healthcare facilities where we have central heat plant and no individual building meters. Once we install the necessary meters for each building, do you have a recommendation on a system to get that data from the meter to a database like Energy Star Portfolio Manager to make use of it?
The Portfolio Manager system isn't necessarily set up for housing that meter data. So once you get that metered information out, now you would have over time, you'd have a monthly consumption load. You might have to do some work of getting that information in a form that Energy Star will accept in terms of how you're accounting for the square footage within those buildings and so on. That's something I can talk to somebody in our organization a little bit more about. We'll take your name and do a little more investigation on that about working down at that level. Typically, when we interface with Energy Star for the buildings that we manage for our clients through that process in our portfolio, we're typically sending in site-level information in there. So that's something we can find a little more information out about.
Thank you, Rick. It looks like we have addressed all of the questions that have come in up to this point. So with that, we will conclude the Q&A session. Should you have any additional questions or concerns, you will be redirected to our Contact Us webpage after the survey, and we will be sure to respond to you quickly. This concludes our presentation for today. Thank you for joining us.